here, and today I'm going to show you how to clean, grease, and oil a Shimano Curado 200E7, one of the best reels ever made. A lot of guys still throw them even though they haven't been made for several years. I'm going to go through and take this reel almost all the way down to the frame. I'm going to show you a few key things to watch out for, and where to grease and oil, and how to disassemble and reassemble. It'll take a little bit, but we're going to take it in steps as far as cleaning, disassembly, cleaning the parts, and then reassembly, and then oiling and greasing throughout that process. And along the way I'll show you a few of the modifications I made to this reel here to make it perform better. I have about 15 to 20 of these reels in my rotation that I've used some of them for up to 10 years, so they're one of the best reels ever made, and they can last quite a long time if you know how to work on them. So that being said, we'll start the cleaning process. And before we start the cleaning process, I will show you the tools you are going to need here. I have them laid out here. Not a lot of tools. Some of the stuff you already have, maybe a few specific items you won't, but it's not too crazy. So you will need a 10mm nut driver. That makes the job a lot easier. It's not required, but it does help immensely. We'll be using that here to take the handle off. It makes you can get it just that much tighter, and you don't have to risk stripping threads or running off the side of the nut with an adjustable wrench. Now you may need an adjustable wrench. It is not required. Sometimes some things get sticky and won't unscrew, and that's where this comes into play. I'll show you a few tricks so you don't need to use this, but it's a good idea to have it on hand if you do. This little pick tool, they sell them at Harbor Freight, any store. They're cheap, 99 cents. It just saves you a lot of headaches when you're digging in these tiny parts. I use it to grab things, remove things without damaging them, things of that. So it's good to have. Along those same lines, here's a toothpick. This is a little bit fatter toothpick. You can get it at your grocery store. I use this mainly to pull the bearings without damaging them, and to apply some of the grease to some of the smaller areas. Then you have just your standard flathead screwdriver. This is a smaller one. Many people already have one. So, and then here's a standard small Phillips head screwdriver. This one is going to be used a lot to take the side plate screws off and things of that nature. An old toothbrush. This is very important. An old toothbrush is great for cleaning off any of the debris, dirt, grime, anything that water gets on that reel and leaves a lot of stuff behind. So that's the number one thing you're trying to do here. Even if you don't take the reel apart, clean it, oil it, and grease it, whatever you do, you need to get the exterior of this reel dirt free. Get all that dirt and grime off of there. That's what really hinders performance. That's what dirt gets into those bearings and makes the reel not perform properly. So a good old toothbrush will really help you. And what you're going to use that toothbrush to use is just regular old rubbing alcohol. This is 70% here. That's what we're going to be using for our cleaning solution. And then the other thing you're going to need is a lot of Q-tips. You're going to go through quite a few Q-tips on each reel, probably 15 to 25 on each reel, because some of these reels can be very dirty. This particular reel we're working on today, I clean all my reels every off season. Up here in Michigan, we have a lot of downtime throughout the winter, so I have a lot of time to do that. So this particular reel isn't that dirty. Some of the reels you're using, flipping, pitching in the grass, and all the flipping mats especially, you're going to have a lot of junk on there, a lot of dirt and grime, and it's going to take quite a few Q-tips to get something like that clean. Then here's another quick little thing I have here, a little trick. This is just a red Solo cup, and I cut it down to about 1.5 inches. That simply, we're going to use that just to hold the reel frame once we get it disassembled. When you have it disassembled, there's a lot of parts that can move and fall out at certain points. So you just want to have somewhere to set it, so you don't always have to be holding it, and risk parts falling out if it tips over, what have you. We have just some simple painter's tape. That's just a trick to, we'll cover the line here on the spool. and make the line more manageable. It's not required, but it's nice to have. Some grease. This is some Shimano grease. You can get it at any of the online tackle retailers. Any standard reel grease will work. I've just always used the Shimano. As far as oil, this is Lightning Lube high-speed oil. I've been pretty happy with it. It's Spool Bearing sells it. What I really like about it, you can use other oils, but the one thing you need to make sure of, this needle-style applicator. That really helps you put the oil where you want and keep it away from where you don't want it. So, one other tool before we move on, a couple optional items, is here is a ratcheting T-driver set. This can be helpful if you have a screw that won't come loose, anything like that. You don't want to strip these screws. Sometimes when you have a really tough one, you can go to this and you can get it off without stripping it. Another optional item, I have a Dremel tool here. I'll show you how to make a cleaning tool that goes out of a Q-tip here that goes into the Dremel tool, and specifically we'll use that for cleaning the pinion bearing. It's not required to have this tool. It does make it nice, and it really does improve casting distance when you get that pin inside of that pinion bearing clean. So that if you have this, it's a good thing to do if you have it. The first step to reconditioning any of these reels is you're going to want the reel clean before you take it apart and dig into it. So the first step here is I'm going to take a little bit of painter's tape, about 5.5, 6 inches, and I'm just going to tape down that line on that spool so it doesn't get in the way when we're working with the spool. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape a little bit, and I'm just going to reel it up with my hand, and then there's a little bit of tag end. We'll snip that off. Okay. Scissors. So I snip that off. And so now that line is not going to get in the way when I take the spool off here in a second. And another good thing to have while you're doing this is you're going to have a lot of little pieces of garbage, dirty Q-tips. I've got a bucket right here on the floor next to me, so that's always handy to have just to put your garbage in. So now we have the reel here. We've taped up the spool. Step number one in the cleaning process is going to be to remove the spool. So I have the spool here. I always shut my brakes off. I always store with no brakes and with no drag. It's just a habit of mine. I don't know if it does anything. I know it saves your drag a little bit. I don't know about the brakes, but it's just something I always do. And it lets you know how the reel's spinning when you're done cleaning it. If you have the brakes on, you can't really tell how good of a job you did, if you did something a little off or there's something that needs to be addressed. So it's always good to shut those brakes off. Now I'm just going to clean this part off here. I've dipped this Q-tip in the rubbing alcohol, and I'm just going to wipe everything down, any dirt, grime. I'm just going to go across any of the edges or surfaces where parts are in contact, like this spool shaft here. This edge here runs along the frame. This other edge runs along the frame as well. If I start to see too much, there's a little bit of dirt and grime on there. When there's too much on there, I'll switch sides, and then when that side's done, I'll throw it away. Q-tips are cheap. You don't want to be spreading dirt around the reel. Those little specks of dirt and grime are your enemy, especially on the spool and any other moving parts that are moving during the cast. So I'm going to clean the shaft off here, just like that. It's pretty simple, and then I'm going to set that aside for later. It's always a good idea too to have a schematic. I have a schematic of the reel here. This one happens to be for a Chronarch E7. It's the same schematic as the Curado E7. The parts are interchangeable. It's assembled the same. Just in case you have any issues, you could always look at the schematic and see how something goes. So it's always helpful to have. So since we have this door open, this side plate door here, what I'm going to do is there's a little retainer clip in there holding that bearing, that spool bearing in there. I'm going to hold this down, hold the clip down with my one finger, and then with this pick tool, pop open the clip. It's very important to hold it down, because these will go flying across the room and you will never ever find them. They go very far and they're very small and weightless, and you'll never hear them land and you'll never find them. Now I'm going to use this fat toothpick. Just going to stick it in the middle of that bearing and I'll wiggle it around. Sometimes they get set in there a little bit and it takes a little bit of doing. So that one was stuck in there pretty good. So that bearing is out now. I'm going to go back to that tool. There's a little disc in there. I'm going to remove that disc as well. Okay, and what I like to do, just to keep myself organized, as I remove parts, I like to clean them. So I run these are ABEX 7 ceramic spool bearings I have here, the orange seals. I run these dry. It makes them cast a little bit further. The stock bearings you're going to oil and you can soak them. I prefer not to soak these. I just do a quick cleanup. You know, again, this Q-tip is soaked in rubbing alcohol. Just a quick cleanup of the surface. I just want to get any dirt, grime, or debris off of there. And then I will take a clean paper towel and just pat it down and spin it. And I'm going to set all these parts here to dry. And same thing here, I'm just going to, this little disc, I just want to clean off any dirt or debris and then set it aside to dry while I'm working on the rest of the reel. Now, with that spool removed, we have access to where the dirtiest part of the reel is, underneath and around that spool. And before we do that, let's take this level wind guard off here. Yeah, that's where you're going to use your flathead screwdriver. You don't have to do this at this point, but it will give us a little more access. There's a lot of dirt I'm seeing in there on the level wind itself, so we're going to want to get in there really good. So I'm going to take this flathead. Sometimes this is hard to start. Make sure you're squared up in it pretty good. You do not want to strip this. That goes for any of these screws on here. Just take your time and square up real nice. Sometimes they take a lot of force. So, and make sure the reels are not cold. If you have them stored cold outside, sometimes they can really stick. You want to put them in the house overnight and let them heat up before you really get into them, because you could strip some screws and they just don't seem to work as easy when they come from a cold environment. So there's that little level wind guard screw. It's just a long screw threaded. It's a flathead. I just wiped it clean. We'll set that aside for later. Once you do that, this little level line piece, it'll pop right off, and we're going to get access to all this here. But before I do that, I'm going to clean this off quickly. Just taking my rubbing alcohol, dipping the Q-tip. I'm going to get as much of it onto the Q-tip as I can. And now, as a finishing measure, I'm going to dip the toothbrush in rubbing alcohol, try and loosen up any of those loose dirt particles that are stuck in there. There tends to be a lot on these level winds, especially if you're fishing around grass, and we'll just get it all touched up and clean. So, and I will dry it clean now with the Q-tip and get what I can as far as the residue. We will set this aside for later. The other note you should make is that I have a towel here. This towel is very important as to the parts will not roll off at all these little screws, these little bearings. You see all these little parts we're taking? If you have a hard flat surface, they could roll off. You could breathe on them and move them across, you know. The towel kind of grabs them and keeps them from rolling off. It also protects whatever your surface on if the rubbing alcohol were to leak through or anything like that. So now we have good access to the inside of the frame where the spool was. You can see there's a good amount of dirt and grime there. This isn't bad, but it's also not good. This reel this year was used for some light pitching around docks and weeds, so it got some gunk. Not as bad as you'll see on your frogging or your flipping rod, but there is some actual big pieces of gunk in there. So I'm going to get a Q-tip, and I'm just going to start gathering what I can. You want to be mindful to not put anything into this level wind track here with this gear. you want to keep that area as clean as possible. So you're going to strategically work around that area. And this is going to take quite a few Q-tips. And what we're going to do is we're going to Q-tip it first. And then once we're satisfied with the Q-tip, we are going to go over it again with the toothbrush and loosen up anything we may have missed. And then we'll do a final cleanup with the Q-tip again. So that one's pretty dirty. I'm going to discard that, and I'm just going to keep going through Q-tips here. This cleaning process is the most tedious process of the whole thing. It's the most important though. If you're going to do anything, just clean the reel. You could just clean it and put some oil on any of the bearings you oil and some of these moving parts, and you'll be good to go. You don't have to go as far as to strip this thing down as far as I'm going to show you today. But cleaning your reels is very important. I'll do it on the boat sometimes at night. You know, if I'm flipping and pitching, I'll pop that spool out and I'll just make sure to get all that big gunk. Sometimes you can find whole chunks of weeds laying down here. Anything that gets caught in that line is going to get rolled up into that spool, and it's just going to get thrown off around into the inside of this reel. So another trick too, once you get this level wind area cleaned around the level line, you can turn the reel handle and move the positioning, and you can get different angles and get under where it was and get everywhere you need to get. There's really no need to disassemble this section unless you're having an issue specifically related to this. You can clean around it. A lot of things on these reels I don't like to dig into unless I absolutely have to. I've had issues where the level wind will get clogged up from gunk in there, and I've had to take this whole assembly apart. Not the easiest thing to do. It's not the hardest thing to do, but it's not something you want to be doing if you can avoid it. So just keeping it clean on a regular basis will save you a lot of headaches in the long run. So there's quite a bit of gunk in here. I'm getting as much as I can. Now I'm going to move to these. Oh, there's a big piece. See how much gunk is in there? That stuff gets in the spool or gets in the level wind gear. You know, you're going to have issues. That's the stuff that'll ruin bearings. Another Q-tip. And I'm going to get into the foot part that connects to your reel. This is going to be very, very dirty. There's a lot of gunk and a lot of big pieces on here. You can visually see them. You need to just rub over everywhere, loosen it up. And as you can see, there's a lot of gunk. A lot of gunk. All right. I'm going to go ahead and close the side plate. We're not going to need access to that for a little bit. I'm going to leave everything off. All the parts are not going back on the end. We're stripping these parts off and setting them aside. I like to set them with their screws and everything. However the screws are ordered, I set them in that order on the towel here so it doesn't get as confusing later. So now I'm going to get my Phillips screwdriver, okay, and I'm pressing fairly hard into it, and I'm squared up pretty good, and I'm just twisting it. You don't want to just turn it. You kind of want to twist it and let it tell you when it wants to go. If it doesn't want to go, you got to really square up on it and be careful because these will strip fairly easily. Now I'm going to take my pick tool and we're going to get this nut cap off of here. Sometimes they get on there pretty good, and there it popped off. Now what I'm going to do very quickly, I'm just going to take a Q-tip here, and I'm going to just clean it off, get any gunk, especially on the inside. There's typically not a lot on this part, but it's just good measure to do it now. I'm going to reassemble it so you can hold it in one piece like that. I'm going to set it aside for later. Now here is where the 10mm nut driver comes in very handy. As you can see, that the sides of this nut don't have a lot of surface area. It's very shallow. It only goes about halfway on the nut, and you can see in the past where it's been rounded off. This nut driver prevents you from doing that. Gives you a lot more life out of your handle nuts. They're made, I believe they're made of aluminum or zinc, so they do strip out fairly easily if cross-threaded or anything like that. So you want to be squaring them. I've got this reel securely in my palm. I'm holding the handle from moving. I'm squared up, and just like that, you just loosen it up, and then you can take it off with your hand. And we'll disassemble this here, and then we'll clean those parts here in a second. One thing I want to show you, you may need an adjustable wrench if you do not do this little quick step here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to loosen everything before I take this star drag off. And now I've got it loosened. Now be careful when you take. I'm going to take it off now. Be careful when you take it off, because there is a spring under there, and you don't want it to go shooting across the room. So here's that spring. Whenever I take off a spring, I work on that part immediately. You don't want to set this aside and forget about it, and tool lands on it and it goes flying across the room and you never see it again. So I just do a quick wipe down of this spring, the drag spring, and I'm going to set it here on the towel on its side like this so it doesn't bounce. Okay, now you've got your drag system, your drag nut here. We're just going to do a quick wipe down with the toothbrush. I'm going to do the whole side plate and the whole frame. Just get this whole thing, now that we have an opportunity, before you take it apart. Well, you've still got it assembled in one piece. You want to just get it worked down. So there, we've got that. Now you remember I set the handle aside. We'll just quickly clean this handle up. And what you want to do is you want to clean these parts as they're coming off, so you give them plenty of time to dry. We are going to apply oil to these knobs later, but I want the alcohol to be completely dry before we do. So it's good order to do these as you take them off rather than right before you assemble them. So this is a standard stock handle here. I do have a lot of carbon fiber upgraded handles for different lengths, but this stock length is good for anything you want to move quickly. This is a 7-to-1 gear ratio. It's got good enough power, and it's good for like pitching jigs and things like that. I like this handle length. I'll go to some of the longer handle lengths for cranking and things where I need a little bit more power and speed isn't as big as a concern. So I have this handle all cleaned up. We'll wipe down these knobs. These are Power Grip 2 knobs, very nice knobs. A lot of guys upgrade the knobs. I actually prefer these Power Grip 2s myself, so that's why they're stock. Alright, I've set that aside. Now, we have the side plate. We're going to disassemble this here. We've already cleaned it up a little bit. And we'll set it over here. We still have the... Quickly, let me get this nut and keep it with the handle. And we'll clean up the star drag. Just going to do a quick wipe down. These parts don't get particularly dirty for the most part. I mean, there's not much access in there. Just mainly a cover for this nut here. So now we're going to get into this drag nut assembly. Now here you can have some potential issues. Right here is, once you remove that nut, these washers come out. And these washers go in order, so pay attention to the order. And I'll go over that on reassembly. What you have here is the anti-reverse bearing that the spool shaft rides on. This can fall out. So doesn't fall out easily, but it's possible. So just be mindful of it once you take this nut off. It's you can put it back in, it's not the end of the world, but you do have to put it in the correct direction. If you assemble it backwards, the reel will want to run reel backwards but not forward, which will not make it operable. So I've got that there. I'm going to clean out inside these little screw basins. Okay, so there. Now we'll clean these washers off very quickly. These do get dirty, so you do want to clean them. Just wiping them down with a Q-tip and alcohol, and then I am laying them in the order that they came off on the towel over here so I can remember which way they go. It's important to clean out the threads on this nut here. It is possible for debris to get in there, and sometimes these can be difficult to start if you have too much gunk in there, but this one is pretty clean. Alright, now we're at the stage where we're going to open this thing up and see the guts of this reel. So we're going to get our Phillips, and what we're going to do is I'm going to palm this, and I'm going to press very. I've got the screwdriver in there securely. I'm going to press down pretty hard. You got to be careful here, and I just broke it free. I'm going to go around and break off, get everyone started. These all went pretty easily. I like to break them all before I take them off. I tend to have my issues if I take these two completely out, and then this last one is the one that's the issue, so I like to break them all before I go. Now these 3 screws are what holds your side plate on, in addition to this screw, this level wind screw we took off at the beginning. That also holds it on, so if you just took these 3 and this was still on there, it won't come off, so you need to have them all off. Now it's important to note here, this top one here, this top middle, it is longer than the other 2. I don't know why they did that. I'm sure they had their reasons, but it's definitely something you don't want to forget. So to make it easier to not forget, I'm going to lay them on the towel in the order they came out in the orientation. So the other 2 are the same size. Okay, now we have those screws off, and we have the level line screw off on the back side. I'm going to simply remove this. Now I remove that very slowly and steadily because you do have to be very careful here. You'll see 2 more springs here. These will go flying across the room if they're bent up, or you take it off at an angle or press it the wrong way. I've had it happen, and then you spend about an hour laying on the floor looking for them. It's not fun. So I'm going to have 2 of these. I am going to very carefully wipe them off. You don't want to shoot them across the room, by no means. That will ruin your night. And I'm going to set them on their side over here. It's very important to set them on their side. So once those are securely off, we can start disassembling the rest of this reel. Now I just picked this up, and you can see here's the inside piece. For the this is the piece that rolls on the anti-reverse bearing. So we'll set that aside for cleaning. Carefully pull this main gear off. Now it's going to be very dirty from the grease, and it is going to stick to the shaft a little bit. It's a pop-in fit, so it doesn't just sit there. It's kind of sometimes it takes a little wallowing back and forth to really pop like that. See it there. Hopefully I'm not blocking you there, sorry. Okay, now this main gear, just dump it over. It has a cover, and then it has a drag washer on the inside. I'm going to take this pick tool and just pop out that drag washer. And what I like to do for these drag washers, these are Carbon Tex drag washers. This is an upgrade. It will give you smoother drag and a little bit stronger drag, so if you're using it for heavy applications, it's not a bad idea. Even for lighter applications, it gives you a smoother drag. So they go for about 12 bucks. It's not a bad investment. If you're going through the trouble of taking this whole reel apart, you might as well throw these in there while you're on. They're a lot stiffer. The stock drags after a while can rip and tear and leave a lot of debris behind. They're also a lot dirtier, as they're almost rubberized where they leave some stuff behind. So these are a lot cleaner, and they perform a lot more consistently and better. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a clean paper towel and just wipe both sides of these down. I don't apply grease to any of these. You want the drags to not to slip, so it's important to keep the grease off them, and I'm just going to set it aside. Then this anti-reverse pawl here is going to pop off in concert with this gear and this drag washer, so they kind of go together there. So there's your second drag washer. Again, that's a Carbon Tex. A little bit of an upgrade, not necessary, but it's nice to do. So here I have the guts. I'm going to take the pinion gear out with its little holder, pinion gear holder thing. So there's the insides of the frame. This is as far as we're going to go at the moment. I'm going to clean these parts, and then we'll get back to this, and I'll show you how to clean this and what to watch out for. There's a few items there you want to be careful with. So I am going to clean all of these parts here, and since they're so heavily greased, I'm going to clean this last because it's loaded with grease. My tools and towels are going to get very dirty. I'm just going to toothbrush them with some alcohol, and then wipe them down. Then for a final wipe down, I'm actually going to use the towel here and just flip it around a few times just to get any grease off of it. I'm going to set it aside over there. It's important to get all the grease, especially on the components that are touching the drag washers. So we'll continue with this piece here. And again, this may not be the way that's recommended. I wouldn't imagine the recommended methods are too far off, but this is the way that I've developed for the past 8 to 10 years. I get these reels to perform how I want them, so it's kind of how I've learned to do it the best. Do a couple passes on that. That one's clean. Now on this piece here, I'm going to use the Q-tip as well. Make sure I get the inside real good. Dry it off nice and good. That is the piece that's going to go on the anti-reverse bearing, so you want to ensure that there's nothing on there. Any grease or oil on there could cause your anti-reverse to fail. Now this device here is the anti-reverse pawl. It serves as the fail-safe for the anti-reverse bearing, that if it were to fail, it only lets, with this gear here, it only lets it go one way, and it can only go so far back if that anti-reverse were to fail. They come on these reels stock. If you don't want it, you could take it off. I don't know of any benefit to taking it off. It doesn't affect performance in any way as long as that anti-reverse bearing is working correctly, but I just leave them on just because. Okay. There's going to be a lot of grease here on this pinion gear holder, so I'll get it with the Q-tip before I go over to the toothbrush, because as the reel spins, it just builds up on here. The grease does. As those gears spin around, the grease is just building up. And that can become an issue if you put too much grease. And that's why you pay attention later when I'm greasing the gear here. You don't want too much grease. A little bit of grease will do the job. Too much grease will just make a mess of the inside of your reel. And you will see sometimes, especially with stock reels that haven't been worked on, they may have just globbed it in there. And when you take that side plate off, it's an absolute mess. So this is a particularly clean reel and relative to some of your stock, since I do clean these every year. So there's that little retainer, and it's nice and clean. And to this point, we're just disassembling and cleaning, so there's nothing too complicated. As long as you can remember how to put it back together, and that's what this video is for. You can go back and look. Alright, I'm going to clean the inside of this. It's important to get this nice and clean and smooth, because that's where the drag washer rides. And then another drag washer rides along the back of this gear. So it's important to keep that grease free and nice and smooth. Now I'm going to take the toothbrush and I'm going to clean all the teeth. Just rock it back and forth and work my way around. This gear is pretty stained and dirty. Most of them will be more brass colored and shiny. This one, I don't know if it had some water on it or what in the past. A lot of these reels I've bought used and refurbished them, so this one could have been exposed to a lot of water before I had it. So it is pretty stained. You just want to make sure these teeth are clear of any build-up dirt, gunk, anything like that. If you do see it, you can take it with, actually I prefer to use the toothpick so you don't damage the gear, but you can clean out these individual teeth if the reel is particularly bad. Sometimes you may have one little straggler here or there. I don't see any. Oh, there's one right there as we speak of it. So what I'll do is I will scrape it out with the toothpick, hit it with the toothbrush, and we are good to go. Now I'm going to just hit both sides, and then I'm going to roll it along to get any excess dirt, grime, what have you off of here. Now while we're working, I'm not just going to set this gear aside. I am going to soak it in the alcohol container. So I have a little bucket here of alcohol, and I'll let that soak and loosen up any dirt or grime. So now we are to the pinion bearing. If you've ever, this connects to the spool right here, and this is the piece that spins along the spool engages here while you're reeling. It engages on these channels, and this gear turns that main gear we were just working on, and that's how your reel turns. Now if you've ever casted and you've had the reel engage halfway out and you heard something break, this is what's going to break. This is a fairly common part to break compared to the rest of the reel. It doesn't break often, but it does happen, and this is the part you'll have to replace. They do recommend replacing the main gear and this pinion gear in concert at the same time. And you can even see there's a little damage there on there, so I must have engaged the reel while I was casting. I've done it both ways. It does work better when you switch both gears out at the time. It is a lot pricier. If you just need the reel to be serviceable and not super buttery smooth, you can just drop a new pinion gear as long as there's no damage to the main gear. But they do recommend you do both. So I'm going to clean this off. Okay, it cleaned up pretty good actually. I'm going to take a Q-tip and get in one side and get in the other side. Now here's a little trick. So I'm going to take a Q-tip here, and I am going to remove the majority of the cotton. I'm going to take that Q-tip down to a point where it will fit. I want to leave a little bit of cotton on there, and I'll twist it up, just a little bit of cotton on the surface, and I'll soak it in that alcohol, get it flattened down. Now you see how clean that is. I'm going to take it, now it fits inside that pinion gear. So I'm going to clean out. This is very critical to casting distance. Any grease, this is where the spool rides inside of this pinion gear. So in a casting scenario, you see all that dirt and grime coming out of there. Anything that's on the inside of this will restrict your spool from spinning freely. Some guys even go as far as to clean this with an abrasive to take a little bit of material off. You don't have to go that far. But since we've made this Q-tip here, I'm going to show you another trick. This is totally optional here. What we did just now with the cleaning is totally sufficient. So I've cut this Q-tip, the end of it off, and it'll fit in there. I'm going to take this Dremel tool. I will stick it in the Dremel tool, tighten it down. And then you can clean it with the Dremel tool. Now be careful, I'm going to hold it with my bare hands here because we're not going to do a lot, but if you plan on doing a lot of polishing, You do want to hold it with something because it will get particularly hot. So I'm just going to stick it in here and flick it on for a second. And I just worked it up and down on there. I'm going to come in from the other side. And now you can see if you hit it at just the right angle, that thing's polished to a shine in there. So it looks nice and clean. And we're going to let this as well soak in the alcohol bath. And we'll clean it again before we do our final assembly. That alcohol will loosen up any other dirt and debris in there. Okay, back to this side plate that we set aside earlier. You can see this grease in here. If you over grease your reel, that's a little bit of grease. That will be everywhere if you over grease your reel. So some of the stock reels you'll take apart and they'll just have grease everywhere in here. This one's going to be pretty easy to clean. There's not a lot of grease. You just want to get it out of there. Start fresh. So I've got that going. So that's nice and clean. We're going to go over to the other side. This is where your other spool bearing is housed. We are going to unscrew that. This is your tension adjustment knob that you use for adjusting your reel tension. You take the cap off. You unscrew this spring. That spring is threaded in just under the surface. It just sits there. We'll clean that off quickly. And then we will set that on its side so it doesn't bounce around. Out of the way. We'll again use our toothpick here. You do have access to the back side. You can poke it out, but I just pull them out. There's our other ABEX 7 ceramic bearing. The stock bearings will be silver. These bearings perform better in terms of casting distance and I believe longevity as well. I've had a lot of the stock bearings that don't stand up to the gunk and grime as well as these do, so it's just a little thing that I know I don't have to worry about it because I have these. I might not need the casting distance for pitching or flipping, but I know I'm not going to have any issues. Alright, we're going to clean out with this was the clean side of the Q-tip to get inside first before we get gunk on it, get the inside of the bearing compartment. Then I'm going to go everywhere else around on this side plate. Okay, we're going to go back to the toothbrush. Just wipe everything down. Don't get too much in here. We're going to touch that here in a minute. That's the anti-reverse bearing that's set in there. You don't want to get oil soaked in there, or not, alcohol rather. You just don't want it to soak in there. It's okay if it touches it, but you just don't want to puddle it up in there. So there's that back side that we cleaned up previously. I'm just going to rough it up again, loosen up any of that grease. Now I'm going to take a dry Q-tip. I'm going to go around and just sop up that oil. And you can see how much grease we got. Again, not oil, I'm sorry, it is alcohol. It's a tedious, painstaking process, but once you see how these reels perform and how they hold up, it is worth it. I do mine every year, but you really don't need to. They'll last several seasons. And any of this grease in here, you want to be sure to get it out because it can work its way into this bearing here or this anti-reverse bearing here. So grease not where you want it is not your friend. It will cause failures. Okay, now I have a clean side of a Q-tip here. Clean Q-tip, I soaked in alcohol. We're just going to lightly, not a lot of alcohol, just going to lightly roll in the direction that the reel handle turns. Just pretend that Q-tip is the reel handle and you're reeling the reel. And you'll see all that gunk and grime. I'm not trying to put anything into those anti-reverse rollers. I just switched Q-tips again because it was dirty. But I do want it to be clean to function properly. Any dirt that builds up in there, it will be trouble. So now this side plate is nice and clean. I will set it off the side to dry. Okay, now we have this spool tension knob here. I'm going to take this pick and I'm going to pop that little square piece there. And underneath there's a rubber disc. You can see how shiny that rubber disc is. There's moisture built up on there. That's why you take this out. You don't have to do this. Anywhere I see moisture in these reels, I like to get cleaned out, because moisture will affect performance over time. Now I'm going to clean the outside of this cap up with the toothbrush. Then we're going to dry it up with the Q-tip. Set that aside to dry. We're going to give these a once over with the Q-tip. Set them aside to dry. And again, I'm keeping all these parts together next to each other. It will definitely make it easier to reassemble when you see them lying in order there on the towel. Okay, now we're using this little solo cup holder I have. This one's cracked a little bit. Probably need a new one. But what we're going to do here is I'm going to take a toothbrush and alcohol, and I am going to just get in there and loosen up all that grease and dirt I see. There's a pretty good amount on here, not a ton, but enough that you got to get it off. So I've got it pretty well covered, loosened up. Now I'm going to get in there with the Q-tip and start picking it apart. Oh, I'm sorry, blocking your view there. Alright, we're getting this all nice and clean. It looks pretty good. Now I'm going to do something here, but I'm going to give you a warning, and I'm going to give you a warning again here in the couple minutes, just because it's very important. This is the part where it could get difficult if you do this the wrong way. Now you can see over here, here's the channel I mentioned earlier that was on the outside of the thumb bar, where the gunk and grime can come in and bind up your thumb bar so it can't engage properly. You need to clean this good. To get access to it, you need to engage the reel like you're going to make a cast. But it's very important to note that this system here is spring loaded. And we're going to remove this here in a minute. We have not done that yet. If you remove this and you engage that thumb bar, this whole assembly is going to pop off and you're going to have to reassemble it. And it's not an easy task. We're not going to be doing that in the video today. This assembly of this unit here, you don't really need to do it unless it's super dirty. But it's not something you should be digging into until you're comfortable with the rest of the reel. It's not an easy task. You can do it, but you better understand how it goes together, or have another reel to copy off of, because it's a very precise fit, and it's under tension, so it's not easy to assemble. So since we still have these screws connected here, I am going to hit the thumb bar, and what that does is, you see, we gain access. And now this piece will slide around and we'll get a little bit more dirt and grime out of there. And this is where the dirt and grime is going to hide. If you're having issues with the thumb bar depressing, underneath this piece is where you're going to have issues. You can see a little bit there. But you see this one is moving freely. There's dirt and grime blocking this from moving. It will not move freely and you're going to have issues. So some of those older, dirtier reels, I've had to take them everything off, clean it, reassemble it, You can even take this handle shaft here. You can take this whole assembly off as well once you take this off. And there is a bearing under here. If you're ever to have issues where it was tough to reel, not while casting, but tough to reel in, and something felt wrong, it's probably this bearing under here has something wrong with it. It's not an easy job to do. You do have to take this whole assembly off and then unscrew these here. So it's not something you do on a regular basis. For my annual cleanings, I don't get into that, but that is how you do that. But again, once you remove these screws, you're playing with fire here, so I don't want to go any further unless I have to. Okay, we've got that pretty cleaned up. What I'm going to do is this thumb bar is depressed. Okay, I want to re-engage it, and how I'm going to do that, normally you would turn the reel to do that, but since the gearing isn't in place, you're simply going to push this, slide this little piece up here, and you hear it click back in. Click back in. Now if you did that again and these screws were off, that whole thing's going flying. This spring's going flying, this is coming off, this is coming off. It's not a fun situation. Now, the reason we have this little solo cup here, it's a holder for this specific time. We're going to take these two screws out. This is going to come off, and there's going to be a washer underneath as well and a bearing. We're going to clean that bearing out and oil it. This is the only part that you really have to be careful with. When you take that second screw off, you don't want to be moving parts around too much. So I just dropped the screw. Let's show you another trick while we're at it. So to prevent, you saw I dropped that screw there. Here's another little trick. Take your Phillips head screwdriver you're using, you roll it in the grease. So I've got it rolled in grease. Now I'm going to clean off. I'm not going to wipe it completely clean. I want that grease. I wiped off the exterior, but it's still in the interior, on the inside of those Phillips bits there. Whatever you would say. I don't know how you'd say that. So what that's going to do is that grease is going to hold that screw when I unscrew it. So now on the second one, once you get the second one off, see, it holds the screw onto the screwdriver. That's going to be very helpful with reassembly. So you don't have to do it for this step, but you're probably going to want to do it for when we reassemble these little tiny screws. So I've set them aside. Now, I'm going to take this piece off. You may not notice it, so pay attention. There is a little washer in there. It's very thin and very fragile, so be careful with it. There is a washer in there. I'm going to wipe both of these down and set them aside to dry. That solo cup is very important right now because you do not want to be carrying this frame in your hand while this is all disassembled. That's where you get into trouble. You could knock it over. If this spring or button engages, it's all going flying at this point. So again, I've said it several times, but it's for a reason. Be very careful. So I've washed the washer. Okay. I have washed this part with the alcohol and Q-tip. I believe they call this cam system retainer or something like that. But again, I'm going to set it down in order. Then I'm going to take a clean Q-tip and alcohol, and I'm just going to lightly wipe the surface. There's a lot of oil in there from the last time I added oil. Just get that surface of that bearing clean. You don't want to be messing around too much in there. I'm going to take my pick tool, and while I'm using the pick tool, I am going to hold down this assembly. I don't want to press it. I just want to lightly hold it down so the force of my pick tool doesn't give me trouble. And of course, this one's stuck in there really good. So normally that would pop out like this. Here's another little trick to get it out when it's really stuck. So I'm going to hold it with my finger here. I'm going to open up this side plate. This back side of my Phillips screwdriver just happens to be the same size as the opening. So I just put a little light pressure on there, and the bearing pops right out. So you see it popped right out. I get my little pick tool, set it down here. Again, I'm going to clean the surface of this bearing. This is an ABEX 7 ceramic. This is a different size than the spool bearing. This is a pinion gear bearing, is what I call it. I will put the size of this and the size of the spool bearings in the description. Don't know it off the top of my head, but replacing this bearing here is not something most people do. I do it not for performance. This doesn't affect your casting distance or anything like that, but it's just for durability and longevity. If you've got a reel where you're flipping and pitching around heavy grass, you know, or a lot of gunk and grime is going to be on this reel, this is going to be worth upgrading just for the fact that it's not going to fail on you. A lot of the stock bearings, what you'll have an issue where, although it doesn't affect the distance of the cast, if this bearing is bad, it can just completely ruin your casting ability. If you've ever casted out, made a regular cast, and about halfway out it just goes and comes to a stop for no reason, or it'll go 3/4 of the way and then come to a stop, it's generally something's wrong with this bearing here. Could be the spool bearing, but I've seen it. This bearing is right next to the spool. It has direct exposure to the spool, so any of that gunk that's coming in through the spool can get in and into this bearing, and those stock bearings tend to fail a lot easier than these. You see all the steps we took to get to where we could take this bearing out. You don't want to be replacing these often, so to me it's worth the money to have the higher quality bearing. This is an ABEX 7 ceramic, orange seal, just for the longevity and durability, that I'm not going to be in the middle of the season and have to dig one of these apart for that type of issue. Now this bearing, since it is not directly connected to the spool and casting, it shouldn't be touching the spool and casting. It should only be when engaged. I'm going to put oil on it. I don't need speed on this. I need this sucker to just work and work forever. So the oil is going to slow it down, but it's also going to keep it together and keep debris from getting in. So I'm doing one side, the other side, and I am going to do I'm just hitting them real quick right now with this little needle applicator. I am going to do them again when we reinstall. Now I'm going to leave that over there. So we have everything disassembled to the point we're going to take it. If you have specific issues, you'll go past this point. This is where it gets difficult. It's actually pretty dangerous right now to be playing with this. This is spring loaded. If this were to move or that thumb bar were to be depressed, this would shift and pop straight up. So if you have issue with a thumb bar deploying and you can't get all the dirt and grime out of under there, you'll see it. I mean, it's an amazing amount of dirt and grime can hide under this little plate here, so it can create a lot of issues for you. I do see a little hair there. You need to watch for little pieces of the cotton swab, and I want to take a fresh. I like to look for the fur. This one's particularly soft, so I won't use that for a final cleanup. This one's nice and firm, and I'm going to soak it pretty good and then pat it down. This little edge in here, I see a little bit of debris. So what we're going to do now is that bearing we just took out, we're going to put right back in. So just hand press it in there. Then the little washer, that little thin washer I told you to watch out for. Make sure it's nice and clean. You want these parts as clean as you can because they're in direct contact with the bearing. So I'm going to set that right on top of the bearing. Now we'll use my little pick tool to line it up just perfect. Okay. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to take this retainer piece here, and I'm just going to put one screw on it. And this may be difficult for you to see because I may block it, but I'm going to set it in there, and with my left hand I'm going to take the screwdriver. I'm going to hopefully start it here. There it goes. And I'm going to run that sucker down to hold that piece in place. So now you've got one screw holding it in place. Now if you remember the trick we did with the grease to hold these little tiny screws, this is where that's going to come into play. There may still be enough grease on here. Clean these off. Whoops. So you see that screwdriver will hold that little tiny screw so you don't gotta mess with it. Just get it in the hole, get it started. Tighten it down. You don't have to wrench on these. They're gonna get to the threads are gonna get to the end, and they're specifically for that thread hole. So there we go. Okay, now we're back kind of to where we started, and we're gonna start the reassembly process. It's been pretty time consuming to this point. It's a lot easier to put them together with all the clean parts than it is to take them apart and clean. The cleaning is really what takes your time. So it's kind of going to go pretty good from here. So we'll start that. Alrighty. The first part we are going to put back on here, actually we're going to do a little grease first. This isn't necessary because these are plastic gears. I don't know why I do this, just because maybe. But I'll put a little grease on there, run it around, spin it around. I'll wipe it flush with this little tool, or this little toothpick. So now those are running nice and smooth. I don't know if that does anything, but as long as I got it apart, what's the harm? Okay, now we're going to assemble this piece here with the anti-reverse pawl. You do not have to use this if you don't want to. It's just a fail-safe for that anti-reverse bearing. I have reels that don't have them in it. It doesn't affect performance at all. But you're just going to slide it on, and then slide this into the gear, and then onto its post. There we go. See how it spins freely? Now the idea is it'll spin forward, but not backwards. See, I can't go backwards, but I can go forward. So it's going to knock itself down. So if that gear were to fail, it's only going to go one gear back. Or that bearing were to fail, that anti-reverse bearing. That's as far as one click is all you'll get. So okay, we're done for the moment. Here's that Carbon-Tex drag washer, the smaller one. That's going to drop on here. Okay. Now we're going to pull our brass gears out of the alcohol solution. They've been soaking for a little bit. We're going to dry them off nice and good. I'm using a dry Q-tip. You can actually let these sit for a few minutes and get all of the alcohol off of the gear. So I like to get a clean paper towel and press and roll and get all the alcohol out of the gear, because we're going to be applying grease here shortly. So we're going to let that dry. And then, again, this little Q-tip with the cotton removed. We're going to do that, clean the inside of the pinion gear, again, just like we did before, just by hand, just for good measure. Actually fell apart there, so be careful of that. You don't want to leave a little piece of cotton in there. So you can see right in there, you can see it's nice and shiny. That's what you want. That really helps your casting distance. The cleaner the inside of that pinion gear is, the further you're going to cast. Okay, the next step is to grease this gear here. I just take a little bit of my index finger, just like that. You want to keep the grease to the teeth and not on the outside of the inside because you're going to have drag washers there. I'm just going to slowly roll it along and pack that in with my fingertip and go over. Some recommend you only pack halfway around, half the teeth on the gear. I do all the gears. I don't put a lot of grease on. I'm going to wipe off the excess here. I go all the way around. It's not a big deal when you take the reels back apart. You don't want too much, but I like to go all the way around. It's going to spread around on its own when you reel the reel. So this initial pack, it's not going to stay this way for long. But you can do half or you can do whole, whatever you want. Even doing whole after a year, there wasn't much on here when we took it apart, so it doesn't last forever. Okay, now what I'm going to do with a clean rag here is I'm going to go and clean these edges off. Okay, you want to be careful not to rip the paper towel and have pieces of the paper towel in the gearing. It's the last thing you want. So there we go. You can see it's nice and clean. I've got most of it packed. It's not completely packed, but that's fine. I'll put a little more on there for good measure. You can see all those gaps. Yeah, we're going to wipe off the excess. I'm loosely holding it so not to tear. You don't want pieces of paper towel in your gearing system. So I'm going to take a fresh paper towel here, make sure my fingertips are nice and clean. We're going to get into the other drag washer now, so we don't want any grease on the inside where that drag washer touches the surface. You put too much grease in there, it will make that drag washer slip, and that is not what you want. You want your drag washer to pull consistently and not slip, and hold tight when you got it cranked down tight. If you have grease in there, you might crank it down and it might hold, and then you set the hook. There goes your spool opening up, so it's the last thing you want. And with any of these drags, when you're cleaning them and doing maintenance like this, make sure your first time out isn't a tournament situation. Give yourself a couple days on the water to pull on them and let them get set back in. So I just inserted that drag washer. I'll do it again, show you. So I have this drag washer here, this Carbon Tex. This is the bigger one. We've already put the smaller one on the shaft here. This one's going to go inside this main gear. We're going to press it down and set it. Now we're going to put this cap on here. Now if you see, this cap is kind of beveled and dented on one side. I put the flat side up. So there's that. Now we're going to slide this onto the main shaft. It may come apart. You can just put it together on the shaft. That's not a big deal. This cap does not want to go on there. There it goes. All right. So the next step. This is going a little slower because I'm talking to you guys, but when you do this on your own, you get the hang of it. This whole process is 25-30 minutes, so it's not really that big of a deal. But just the showing everything makes it a little longer. So I'm going to take the pinion bearing and place it in its holder there, little plastic holder. That lip is going to go up. You see this lip here? That is going to go up. And the fat side down on the pinion gear. See the fat side down? And we're going to hang it there. Now, again, this little solo cup comes in handy for holding it. So spend the 3 cents on the solo cup. I'm going to set it on the little post. Now I'm going to tilt it, and I'm tilting it back, and I'm going to spin it into the gear there, and it drops down. If it doesn't drop down flush, you see there's a little lip above, but the gears themselves are flush together, you did something wrong. You might have this backwards. It might not be set all the way, but that's how you want it. You want it to be flush. Those gears are, I mean, you could, I'm putting that toothpick over both sets of gears, and there's nothing going on there. Okay, the anti-reverse little thing. These little teeth are going to go down. Make sure you put these teeth down. Some of these reels, it's not on the schematic, but some of these reels, when you disassemble them, will have a little washer here. You can put it there. I don't know what it's for. Maybe their specs are out of line or whatever on some of these reels, and that's how they adjust for it. But I don't see it here on the schematic. I do have, you know, out of 15 to 20 of them, I've got 4 or 5 that just have little washers there. I don't know what they're for. Some have them, some don't. It's kind of crazy. So if you had that washer, put it on right here. You know, a little washer right there. That's what I'm talking about. And I haven't seen it make any difference using them, but I assume they're there for a reason. I just don't know the reason. Now these little springs that I was telling you are big trouble before when they go flying across the room, we're going to assemble those. Now again, this red Solo Cup's really going to help you here, because these things, once you put them on, you don't want any movement. You don't want to be moving the reel. I've got the second one here. I'm just setting them on these posts. Okay, we've got this side plate that we cleaned up nice and clean, and you remember that from a little while ago. We're going to reinstall this at the moment. Very carefully, you don't have to pick it up, but I am picking it up. Very carefully, because of these springs, and you don't want to engage this thumb bar. If you engage that thumb bar now, those springs are gone. So I'm going to wiggle it on here, and it should set fairly easily. If you have to force anything, something's up and you got to look at it. So now we're going to put the screws back together. And as I said before, there's a long one and 2 shorts. The long one is in the top middle, and I laid them out as such on the towel here so I remember. So start that long one. There it goes. A little difficult. So I'm going to get them most of the way there. Just snug it. I'm not going to go crazy on it just yet. I'm going to get them all in and then come back around. So now I'm putting the short one on. Okay. There's the second short one on the bottom there. Okay, now I'm going to knock this one down. You don't want to strip them. They strip pretty easily. But I'm going to go around and see. So that one kind of jumped. That wasn't good. That one moved a little bit. Perfect. Okay, we're going to put it back in the Solo Cup. Now you got to be careful here. This should be in here pretty good, but there is, until you put that nut on there, there's nothing holding that anti-reverse bearing in there. So we're going to assemble those washers and that nut. And what we've got here, so you've got 2, I don't know what to call these, little oval hole washers. Those are going to go on first, and then just a regular flat washer, and then this nut. Now these two they're kind of bent, and you want them bent so there's a gap between them. If you put these two on the shaft and there's no gap between them, one of them's on backwards. I don't know which one, but you got to put them so there's a gap in the middle, kind of like a I don't know, kind of like a spring type action on a bent washer. So what I'm going to do here is I slide that first one on. Now I'm flipping this around so there's going to be a gap in the middle. So if you can see there, it's not much of a gap, but when these two sides touch, there is a little gap. That's going to compress, and that's going to give you your compression. Now this next washer, it's easy to tell which side it goes on because you've got it between a steel washer and a brass nut. One side is going to be yellow brass, one side is going to be silver steel. So you just put the silver steel side down to the silver steel, and then we're going to hand thread this drag nut on. This one went on pretty easy and it's spinning pretty good. If it doesn't want to, you always want to hand start it, but if it's harder to thread down, that's where your adjustable wrench can come into play. And you can adjustable wrench, hold that to give yourself a little bit of leverage, because there is no spool installed yet, so it will just spin. You can put your finger on the inside, but adjustable wrench works a little easier. But if you clean these threads on the nut and on the shaft, it should just hand thread on there. That shouldn't be a big deal. Okay, now that is secure and this nut is holding that whole assembly together, we could shake it around, we can throw it down the stairs, nothing's going to happen to it, you're safe. You're past the point of having to be careful until we get in these springs here in the next step. So, what I'm going to install is, here's our spool bearing. Again, these are AVAC 7 ceramics, these aren't stock. So yours will look silver if they're stock. I'm gonna make sure with a clean Q-tip, make sure the inside of there is nice and dry, and it is. And I'm just gonna pop that in there. And then this tapered spring, you're gonna have you got two springs laying around, make sure you use the right one. One's for this drag system for the drag star, and then this one is the tension knob retainer. What it is you're just gonna get it, dip it under that edge there, and then you're gonna spin it in, and then it's just gonna hold under that edge like that. Okay. Now for the cap. For the cap, we took apart these discs on the cap. We already cleaned all these parts, and you'll notice a little dimple. A little dimple. The side with the dimple, if it's not too deep, I like to keep the dimple side facing towards me. So that's from the spool running along it. It kind of wore itself a little dimple. I like to just let it go unless I have issues. They can get too deep at times, and you can have issues. You'll see here, you can easily see the dimple on that one. That spool shaft is going to run right in that dimple, so I like to keep it on that side. So I'm putting the flat side down, dimple side exposed. This is where that little pick tool comes in handy. So there, we've got that piece, that cap assembled again. And again, this is all back together so we can move it around. So those little pieces don't come out, I'm going to keep it upside down. And then I'm just going to square it up. Be careful with these because they are plastic threads on metal threads. You don't want to mess it up. It should go very easy, just like I did there. You want to make sure you're lined up correctly. Okay, now we are going to assemble the drag star. This spring is simply going to go on there, and then we're going to drop this out. Now you're going to kind of have to twist it. This one's giving me a little trouble here. It's going to drop down there. See that gap? There's not going to be that gap when we're doing it right. See, it just dropped down. So I was just wiggling it. Let's see, I'm not happy with that set. I'm going to tighten it down a little bit. Okay, tighten that drag nut down. Sometimes they'll just pop on there, and other times you got to play with them a little bit. But they'll kind of like jump around, and then boom, there it goes, just like that. See how it dropped down? You can see that lip on that shaft is flush with that drag star cap. Now I'm holding it down there because it is spring loaded at the moment, so you do need to hold this down. And while I'm holding that down, I'm going to go get the handle. I'm putting that handle on there. Okay, and then there's the handle nut. I'm going to start that by hand. It should spin on there very freely. You will strip it if it's not on there right and you put tools to it, so do it with your hand. I've got it flush there with the hand. Now I'm going to get this 10mm nut driver, and I'm going to go to where it feels good and tight. I mean, you can play with these. Now if you see here, this little threaded hole for the nut cap, what you need to do is one of these points on the nut either needs to be pointing directly towards the center of it, or the flat side needs to be dead centered. So I've tightened it where it felt tight, and it's just past where that flat side would be center. So what I'm going to do, you see that there? Hopefully you can see that good. This center needs to come back and be dead center with that threaded piece. Now you could do it manually and do it by hand, but that's the trick. I went a little too far back, so I'm going to come. Okay, that's about perfect. You could learn the hard way and go back and forth, but that's the trick to do it, is you either got to have one of the points centered or one of the flat side centered. So that flat side here is dead center on there. I'm going to take the nut cap, this nut cap here, with the screw, I've just set it in there, and it's just simply gonna, you get the backside hole set. Doesn't want to go. There it goes. Okay, and it just pressed on there. That one was a little tight. Sometimes they just drop on there. It's not a bad thing. And now I am going to, with the Phillips, oops. See, let's look at that. It's a good problem to have, so I can show you one more. It looks like I'm a little off. So I took the screw out. You can see I'm a little off. So I've got to come back a little to the left. So that's a good lesson there. So I'm going to pop this cap back off. Okay. Come back to the left just a smidge. There it goes. And now you can see it's perfectly lined up. I must have been off when I first lined it up, when it didn't want to go on there just easy. Okay, we're just going to tighten that up. And again, it should be super easy to tighten. When I first went to tighten it, so I stopped. Okay, there you've got your reel. Almost back together. It's starting to look like your reel again. Just a few more things to do. So the next step is going to be this cap on the level wind. We just simply slide it on there. Now it's only going to fit one way, but if you really want to look, this little outcropping on the bottom, so the side with two like little feet, that goes to the side plate side. If you need a gauge, so it's in there. It's in there. It'll fit nice and snug. It'll go in nice and easy. If it doesn't, you're doing it backwards. Now here's a little where the work comes in. When you stick this screw back in, you do have to line up the hole in the level wind. It doesn't exactly, it's just flopping there, so it won't exactly line up every time. And then you have to make sure you get the thread started in the hole. So this piece is just going to flop around and you just got to line it up. So it's real easy to move around, it's just loose. I've got it in the threaded hole. If I could screw it, I could do it. There it goes. A shorter flathead would probably be a better idea here. It's going, it just takes a while, and it's gonna you're gonna hit the bottom of the threads, and you're gonna know when you hit it. It's machined just perfect, so the length of the threads are the length of there you go, it hits just perfect. Okay, now we've got that back together, and it does look like a reel now, minus the spool. Now let's go to this side plate. Well, we've got this open here. Let's confirm that these are tight, on this brake side plate. We're going to reinstall the little disc, again, dimple side out. We want that spot at Warren itself. We want to continue to use that little groove. I'm going to use my little pick tool. Set in place. This is very helpful. There's no way you're moving these little parts around like that without it. Could use a toothpick, but that little angle pick tool helps tremendously. Again, ABEX 7 ceramic bearing. This is a spool bearing, the second spool bearing. I will put the sizes in the comments. There you go, just drop it in. Now this retainer clip. This wonderful retainer clip that goes flying across the room all too often. Be careful, or have a bunch of extras, whichever you choose. I'm going to get the pointed end started, and then I'm simply going to press it down, and there it goes. It's not always that easy. I'm lucky it happened that easy that time. So that's fully assembled. Now, I don't grease, or I don't oil these. If you have stock bearings, you may want to oil them. You can oil them, but I have these high performance bearings, so I want to get maximum distance, so I do not oil. We are going to take oil now in a few key areas. Now this pinion bearing, I do oil. We've already oiled it. I'm going to just around the edge by that orange seal. This again is just a barrier for any dirt and debris that comes in through the spool. Okay. Now we're going to install the spool. Remember the spool we took off earlier? I like to put a drop on here. Doesn't last long. It's just for maximum performance when I test it out here. The oil will dry up on that spool shaft, so it's not long for anything. Okay, and one other point I like to oil is this worm gear for the level line. So what I'm going to do is I'm tightening this tension knob so I can tension. I need to run the drag down so I can turn the reel handle. If you turn it without the drag run down, it's not going to do anything. I'm just going to slowly work all that oil in. Put a little more on this side. You want to lubricate it, but it's you don't want too much on there because then it'll collect dirt and debris. It's kind of a double-edged sword. You need some to keep it moving smoothly. You don't really need a lot, but if you put too much in there, if you put grease in there, it's exposed. It's going to catch a lot of dirt and debris. Okay, then we've got all that lubed up. I'm just going to do a drop here on the handle, on the tops of the handles, and then I'm going to spin them around. There are bearings in there. The stock bearings come greased most of the time, which slows them down tremendously. So if you were to take these apart, which I've done in the past, they'll spin a lot better with oil. You can get access to them. It's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but these caps pop out and you can unscrew a nut. They are reverse threaded, so not righty tighty lefty loosey. It's lefty tighty righty loosey, I guess. So it's backwards of what you think because of the rotation of the handle would loosen them under the normal threading. So they are backwards. They're easy to strip. I don't mess with them more than I have to. If they're spinning like this, I'm good. Okay, now I've got the drag star run down. Got to be careful to put that spool tension knob down enough, because if you still have it loose and you spin it, you can hear it's hitting the drag star. You want to at least put it to where it won't hit that drag star. So one more lubrication point right here on the spool. I just get around just a couple little drops there. So confirm your thumb bar is working. If your thumb bar isn't working at this stage, it usually means that those two little springs you put on the post in there, that piece was in the wrong position when you reassemble the reel. You need to open the reel up and move that spring-loaded piece to the disengaged position, and then it should work. That's a mistake I've seen guys run into in the past. But there's a fully assembled reel. Everything, the grease will work in and it'll get a little looser as time goes on. It may feel a little stiff for the moment. It shouldn't be stiff to turn. It's just a little more solid than you're probably used to it feeling. Shouldn't be any wiggle or play or anything. There shouldn't be any parts sitting on the towel at this point. Hopefully not. But you should have a good free running spool. There it goes, nice and running. There's not a lot of line on there, so it's kind of oblong and won't run long, but it's it's a nice smooth spin there. So there you go, that's how you do it. Took a little time, but you can restore some old reels that you thought you're going to have to get rid of and get many, many, many more years of service. So thanks for watching. I'll have some information in the comments below as far as bearing sizes and things of that nature. And I hope this helps.